activist and former university senator from the University of Queensland. He's well known for his criticism of the Chinese government and the Chinese Communist Party. And in December 2021, our speaker launched the Pavlou Democratic Alliance Federal Political Party, whose policies include fighting corruption, protecting human rights, specifically on alleged issues related to the Chinese Communist Party, and tackling poverty and homelessness. So I hope we'll give Drew Pavlou a warm welcome. Thank you. Very cool, very cool. I'm very happy to be here. Bigger crowd than I was expecting. I'm very thankful for everyone who's come out here. Very happy. I've got my Playboy Cardi Van Bantham outfit on. I just want to thank everyone for coming. It's a profound honour to speak here in the same term as Bad Barbie. It's always been a dream of mine to come here to the Oxford Union. I'll start with a couple of acknowledgements first. I want to thank my mates Tim Page and Dilby for their years of friendship, to Simon Fenwick for his immense support, my barrister Tony Morris KC, who's been like a father figure to me, my parents who love me despite being a difficult son, and to Max Mock, Kinzum, Adila, all my friends in the Hong Konger, Tibetan, Uyghur and Chinese diaspora communities, and to some dear departed friends like Kimberly Kitching and Wilson Gavin, who we lost along the way. Their memory will live on forever. Most importantly, I just want to thank my Bapu and Yaya. Came to Australia with just £40 in their pocket. They were forced out of school very early in Cyprus due to poverty. And my family were simple farmers for 1,000 years, so to be here at Oxford, it's very amusing to me. It's very funny. I honestly can't believe I'm here. So thank you to my Bapu and Yaya for sacrificing so much so that I might get to be in a position to deliver a speech like this. So I'll start with something very simple. Has anyone been arrested here? Or has anyone been arrested for terrorism charges? Or has anyone potentially been thrown backwards over a roll of stairs by security at the Wimbledon final after holding up a Peng Shuai sign, the missing Chinese tennis player? Tough crowd, it's all good. Look, I'm a young guy from the suburbs of Brisbane, Australia. I never set out to be an activist, much less an activist against the Chinese Communist Party. I've got no family relation to China. My dad runs a humble fruit shop. And yet the Chinese Communist Party have somehow convinced themselves that I'm a threat to the regime, to the extent that I've been personally denounced by the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs as a stooge of the Taiwanese and the CIA. Both of them, which is great. My dad's got the fruit shop. We've got people on Twitter who sometimes say that the fruit shop's the conduit for the illicit funds and the black bags. I can neither confirm nor deny. But indeed, I would be remiss not to note, I know a number of CCP supporters actually wrote to the Chancellor of Oxford to demand that the speech today be cancelled, which I find very funny because the Chancellor doesn't have that power, I'm informed. And they forwarded the emails to me, I think it's a failed attempt at mind games. I printed one out and I'll briefly read from it. It's very entertaining to me. And I mean, we've got here some amazing prose. Apparently I'm not just a terrorist, but also a pedophile terrorist, which is I mean, a very interesting thing. So they've made their best effort to try and stop me from speaking here today, which is good on them. We've got some very low-level Ministry of State Security staffers in Beijing that are tasked with looking out for Drew Pavlou, very low level. So I want to say, good on you fellas, you're doing a good job. I'm still here despite the attempts to censor me. It's been a wild ride the past couple of years. I will briefly just quickly describe the kind of crazy events that sort of brought me to this stage. Started out with a small campus protest, a 10-person sit-in against our campus Confucius Institute at the University of Queensland. I'd never organised a protest before in my life. Indeed, I actually rocked up late to my own rally because I slept in. So we're not talking the best organised protest here. Was late to it, I slept in. They sent hundreds of Chinese government supporters to surround us and physically attack us on campus. Men in masks, wearing earpieces, coordinating physical assaults on students, on Hong Kong democracy activists on campus. And the University of Queensland responded by bringing in Australia's top law firms to hunt, haunt and expel me. I believe they admitted to Parliament they spent up to $500,000 trying to expel me, which, $500,000, good on them, great use of taxpayer funds. And I won't bore you with my entire biography. Our time here on Earth is very sparse. We have a long question and answer session ahead. But they have escalated the campaign against me in recent months, framing me for a fake bomb threat whilst peacefully protesting outside the Chinese embassy in London. I was arrested and detained incommunicado by the Metropolitan Police, refused access to lawyers. I was interrogated at 4 a.m. after just 2 hours sleep. Police showed me the fake email during my interrogation. Thankfully, they signed off the fake bomb threat with a very nice regards, Drew Pavlou. Very nice, very polite. So I've actually got a copy of the bomb threat here, just to demonstrate the competence of the Metropolitan Police. I mean, this is what we're talking about here. This is the level that we're dealing with. This is almost a complete approximation of the original bomb threat email that they used to go after me. And I just need to thank the Metropolitan Police for keeping the world safe for this one. Regards. So, absurdly and pitifully for the incompetent officers at the Metropolitan Police. I have to say, very incompetent. One of the most incompetent things I've ever seen. I'm still under investigation. I face potentially a 7-year prison sentence. My mum's very upset. I have to be honest, I did not do that fake bomb threat. And if I did it, I would not have put regards Drew Pavlou on it. I mean, I just have to be honest. The situation has sadly gotten even more farcical when they extended the fake bomb threat email campaign even to my family members. So I've got a younger brother named Billy. He's only 21 years old, not political at all, college athlete in America. They actually sent a fake proton mail to LAX, threatening to blow up an airline on his behalf to try free his older brother from the clutches of the Chinese Communist Party. Not a well-constructed email, this one as well. Sadly, we actually had to, that's a terrible thing to do to someone who's non-political, to go after family members like that. They just saw him on my social media. They sent bomb threats to American Airlines using this fake proton mail. And, that was a terrible thing to happen to my family. The Met Police still won't drop the charges. It's lunacy, the abuse of the British legal system against critics of the Chinese Communist Party. And I just have to emphasise, extremely, extremely incompetent on the part of the Metropolitan Police. I've never seen anything like it. They should be ashamed of themselves. They've done a very poor job anyway. So it's important to emphasise though, what I face is nothing, absolutely nothing, compared to what Chinese, Uyghur, Tibetan and Hong Konger dissidents face. You heard how they targeted my family. These are the gangster tactics, the mafia-style tactics they use against dissidents all the time. I've seen things you wouldn't believe. I have a Uyghur Australian friend we will call Michael. Chinese police in Xinjiang called Michael in the dead of the night. Over a video call, they showed Michael his Uyghur mother in the police station. The instructions were simple. If Michael wanted his mum to remain safe, Michael was to tell Chinese police where he studied, where he worked, where his Uyghur Australian wife worked, where his toddler went to preschool. They wanted his passport, his address, his car registration details. He recorded this. He's shown it to me. I've got the footage. He went to the Australian police, but what can they do? He goes to work every day, terrified that he'll come back home and see his family gone. This is happening right now in Australia to countless innocents. They're terrorising innocent families. Some of the stories involving Australian families are just absolutely heartbreaking. I recently spoke to a young 27-year-old Melbourne-born nurse by the name of Mireille. 5 years ago, she married a handsome young man by the name of Mirzat Taher. It was love at first sight. From the moment where I first spoke to him, I knew that I wanted to spend the rest of my life with him, she told the ABC. They were just 2 days away from booking a flight home to Australia where Mirzat is a permanent resident, when Chinese police took him away and they sentenced him to 25 years in prison for alleged separatism. I remember just sitting and crying and shaking my head, Mireille said. A young couple ripped apart at the very beginning of their marriage despite committing no crime. This is just a small subsample of the type of terror that they wage against Uyghurs all the time here. Across the world, the diaspora, people have been terrorised into silence. They respect no borders, they respect no boundaries. Their reach is global and their reach is strong. Their tentacles reach everywhere. They're exporting repression abroad, plain and simple. Just last week, Chinese consulate officials in Manchester dragged Hong Konger protesters onto the grounds of the Chinese consulate in an effort to bash them up. They were rescued only thanks to the quick intervention of police. What would have happened if the police had not been there? These innocent Hong Konger protesters dragged onto the grounds of the consulate, bashed up. It almost defies belief that this is happening right here in Britain. And as of the speech, no one's faced a single consequence for this. Under Xi Jinping's Operation Fox Hunt, thousands of Chinese dissidents and political opponents of the Chinese Communist Party have been pressured and coerced into returning to China to face arbitrary detention and torture. FBI Director Christopher Wray described a typical tactic. Targets are offered a choice between suicide and returning to China. If one refuses, their family members are arrested and held as leverage. And I know there are people here in this crowd as well at Oxford University fearful of being photographed attending this speech. Back home in Australia, we've seen the family members of dozens of Chinese university students targeted because of the thoughts and opinions their children express on campus half a world away. I personally know 2 Chinese students studying in Australia who saw their parents visited by Chinese security officials within 24 hours of them expressing criticism of the Chinese Communist Party in class. I know that Oxford University has asked students with family members in China to submit their scholarly work anonymously to avoid retribution and retaliation from state officials. This is happening right here at one of the great universities of the world. Students fear for their safety. It's little wonder why, when you look at Jesus College at Cambridge, for example, accepting huge donations from Chinese state-backed companies and agencies tied to the Chinese state. Professor Peter Nolan, CBE, director of Jesus College, Cambridge's China Centre, told the world that China's ongoing genocide of Uyghur Muslims was unsuitable for debate on campus, as criticising this ongoing genocide would not foster mutual understanding. Should go without saying, China is a totalitarian fascist state. They will not rest until every inch of the earth is safe for their brutal regime, until each and every last one of us is silenced. This is the nature of their rule. Sadly, too many compromised academics, like Peter Nolan, refuse to recognise this basic fact because their careers and livelihoods depend on obfuscating it. Why is it that the young protesters of Hong Kong could see the truth back in 2019? These young protesters warned the world and they paid the price. They were crushed ruthlessly. The repression was brutal, touched young and old, radical and moderate alike. Take the case of terminally ill 75-year-old activist Koo Si-yu, sentenced under sedition laws to die in prison for planning a protest in Hong Kong. Tell the Hong Kongers, Peter Nolan, about the importance of fostering mutual understanding with a regime that sentences terminally ill cancer patients to die in prison for holding protests that would have been legal in Hong Kong 2 years ago. Well, you could tell the British barristers working for the political prisoner Jimmy Lai about the importance of fostering mutual understanding with the same regime that threatens to prosecute them for defending them. They're going after even the lawyers of defenders, no matter the fact that they're not Hong Konger. Tell the Uyghurs about the importance of fostering mutual understanding as uncles and aunts and fathers and mothers are ripped away from their families and taken to concentration camps. The Chinese government has pushed to cut Uyghur birth rates through forced sterilizations, transferred orphaned Uyghur children to colonial-style boarding schools in which their language and culture are criminalised. Brave survivors of these camps have talked to the Chinese government using rape as a weapon of war against Uyghur women. So how dare Peter Nolan try and minimise these atrocities with facile talk of mutual understanding, as though the victims of this ongoing genocide must empathise and understand the terror state that is persecuting them. He can tell the Tibetans about the importance of fostering mutual understanding. Some 160 Tibetan monks, nuns and ordinary people have burnt themselves alive in protest against the Chinese Communist Party over the past decade. How soul-crushing can things be to prompt hundreds of people to burn themselves alive in silent protest? Does Peter Nolan know more about life under Chinese Communist Party rule than these Tibetans who feel so hopeless as to destroy their bodies in the most agonising and painful way imaginable? The CCP is a uniquely paranoid, powerful, blood-drenched organisation. It's more akin to a transnational organised crime network than a political party. It's uniquely potent in its influence efforts across our democracies. As a totalitarian state, even the slightest hint of criticism constitutes a direct threat to the state and the power of the ruling party. This is why criticism cannot be tolerated at home or abroad. I encourage people to read John Garneau's speech, Engineers of the Soul, Ideology in Xi Jinping's China. He simply takes Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party at their word. He listens to them when they speak. And Xi Jinping openly speaks of writers, thinkers and artists as engineers of the human soul. For him, everything must be subordinated to political ends. The totalitarian project of creating unity of language, knowledge, thought and behaviour in pursuit of a utopian destination. Knowing this, is it any wonder why they export their repression abroad, why they're bashing up these Hong Kongers at the Chinese consulate in Manchester? As early as 2013, Xi Jinping issued a now infamous document, a list of political instructions to cadres, document number 9 it's called, calling on officials to wage intense struggle against the so-called false trends, including the promotion of Western constitutional democracy, universal human rights, civil society, historical nihilism, which is defined as an effort to undermine party history by telling the truth of the brutal regime. John Garneau explains the Chinese Communist Party's position succinctly. The Western conspiracy to infiltrate, subvert and overthrow the People's Party is not contingent on what any particular Western country thinks or does. It is an equation, a mathematical identity. The CCP exists and therefore it is under attack. No amount of accommodation and reassurance can ever be enough. It can only be a tactic, a ruse. Heed these words, no amount of accommodation and reassurance can ever be enough. The party defines itself in existential struggle against the concept of democracy and human rights. It will never see itself as safe until these values are wiped clear from the face of the earth. This is the reality of the Chinese Communist Party. There can be no compromise or appeasement because the Chinese Communist Party has seen itself as at war with us in the democratic West since at least the brutal slaughter at Tiananmen in 1989. We're talking about an extremely powerful totalitarian government wedded to hardline Stalinist ideology, a government open about its intentions for dominance. Their stock charges that the human rights critics of their regime are anti-China, while they themselves brutalise the Chinese people and steal from them on a tremendous scale. Heed the words of Chinese dissident intellectual Zhu Zhangrun. How can the mountains and rivers only be of one colour, red? China belongs to all 1.4 billion of its inhabitants, and no one political party or ruling clique can claim a monopoly. China belongs to the Chinese people, not to the Chinese Communist Party, Xi Jinping or corrupt underlings. It's high time that those in the democratic world recognise this. Recognise that the Chinese Communist Party is not the legitimate ruler of China. What will it take for people to wake up? Xi Jinping is not an aberration or a deviation from the norm. We hear that argument trotted out by the appeasers and the apologists all the time. They say China was on the path to reform and opening, and China only changed because the man at the top changed. Nothing could be further from the truth. The Chinese Communist Party's elite families selected Xi as a consensus candidate. He was the party's backlash to the threat of decay and loss of control. He's now ripped away the veil of legality, progress and prosperity. He's ripped the mask off to show us the frightful beast that lurks beneath the false shiny veneer they hope to present to the world. A brutal dictatorship that operates on the few have principle. A brutal dictatorship with dreams of empire and total control. Trade will not democratise China. We've tested that theory to destruction. It was a convenient lie to excuse Apple, Nike, all the major corporations and businessmen who wanted to make money in China, a country where independent trade unions are banned and labour organisers are disappeared. Every day we have the Henry Kissingers of the world calling for reapproachment, men responsible for genocide, men with blood on their hands themselves. Eric Prince, CEO of Blackwater, I note he spoke at the Oxford Union recently. His firm, Frontier Services Group, a private paramilitary company, opened a training centre in Xinjiang, ground zero for the Uyghur genocide. His firm trained private anti-terrorism personnel in China. My university, UQ, had a professor, Heng Tao-shen, use university resources, Australian Research Council grants, to develop AI technology that he then helped the Chinese government use against Uyghurs, aiding the genocide directly with Australian government funds. The truth is that we are all deeply enmeshed in these horrors, deeply enmeshed and complicit in this greed. There's a pact in blood between Western economic elites and CCP power elites. And unfortunately, this has resulted in the mass immiseration of the Chinese people, one of the most unequal societies on earth. A country where forced labour remains rife while the children of party officials drive Maseratis and Ferraris. Dispel the false propaganda that the CCP lifted hundreds of millions of Chinese out of poverty. The Chinese people lifted themselves out of poverty when the party briefly took the boot off their neck, and now the boot comes down again. The true statistics are horrible and prove that the Chinese people are the biggest victims of the Chinese Communist Party. Read the results of Scott Rozell's 30 years of fieldwork in the Chinese countryside, as summarised in his book Invisible China. 70% of Chinese children have rural hukou status, and the statistics are just heartbreaking. Over half of rural babies are undernourished, according to Scott Rozell's research. This is in a nation that boasts one of the highest numbers of billionaires in the world. More than half of rural toddlers face permanent developmental delays that will unalterably scar them for life, while 40% of school children in rural communities in southern China attend school every day with intestinal worms quietly sapping away their energy. China's trade surplus this year is set to hit $1 trillion. So where is the wealth going? Where's the money flowing? According to Scott Rozell's book Invisible China, more than 30% of rural students have vision problems but do not have access to glasses. They can't see the whiteboard. So can anybody tell me how many billions the Chinese government spends each year on surveillance, censorship, repression to buttress their rule, while 20 million Chinese children in the rural countryside go without glasses in school? These innocent kids are just as deserving of education and a life of dignity as anybody else, but the Chinese regime robs them of the future. Chinese economic development is artificially stunted by the inequality and neglect inherent to Chinese Communist Party rule, and Xi and the party cultivate a hardcore blood and soil Han race nationalism to try and distract from the economic decline that they're pushing the country into, from the blatant corruption and thievery from the Chinese people. It's no coincidence that Xi's in-house philosopher Wang Hunin, one of the most powerful men in Xi's China, relies heavily on the thought of the Nazi crown jurist Carl Schmitt. We see a red-brown fascism emerging, just as we saw under Stalin in the USSR during the days of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Countless local minorities, cultures and languages are subsumed by this Han imperial project, and its lines. He cites Xi Jinping's calls to imprint Chinese national identity deep in the soul of minorities. This is a form of fascism. This is fascist language. It's a strategy of an empire in decay, total decay. For this reason, Xi Jinping's totalitarian project is fragile. It won't succeed. It's so fragile that even a small banner denouncing Xi recently could send shockwaves across the entire world. They had to censor it all across the Chinese internet. People have begun to speak up in China. He will not succeed in totally remaking Chinese society with his engineers of the soul. He will not succeed in terrorising Taiwan into submission and subjecting millions of Taiwanese to re-education camps, as the Chinese ambassador to France recently suggested. I know Paul Keating and many members of the Great Appeasement Brigade, they don't seem to care if Taiwan is subjugated and millions of Taiwanese civilians are subjected to what seem to be, this is what the Chinese government's talking about, concentration camps for Taiwan, the re-education of Taiwanese civilians. Paul Keating, these former politicians have been captured. He sits on the board of a Chinese development bank. These politicians have been captured. They don't seem to care about these terrible humanitarian crises. Xi Jinping, look, he will not succeed in eradicating Catholicism, Christianity, Islam from China, nor will he succeed in eradicating Tibetan Buddhism and Tibetan language and identity. He will not be successful in his genocidal attempts to eradicate Uyghurs from the face of the earth. Pride inevitably goeth before the fall, and Xi and the party have locked themselves into a path of confrontation with almost the entire world. They cannot succeed. We cannot let them succeed. The great scholar Leszek Kolakowski described totalitarianism very simply. Totalitarianism, in its perfect form, is an extraordinary form of slavery without masters. It converts all peoples into slaves and thereby bears certain egalitarian marks. This is true even of Xi. I direct some of my final words to him. Xi, you are once all-powerful and yet a slave to the very system that once brutalized you and your family. Many people don't know, but he was tortured as a youth. His father was tortured, Xi was tortured, his own half-sister was hounded to suicide. Kolakowski said that the unattainable ideal of the totalitarian system was a situation where all people were at the same time inmates of concentration camps and secret police agents. Xi, you grew up under the shadow of labour camps and mass torture, and you rose to impose these horrors on an even greater scale. The irony is that you grew up within the walls of this horrid system. Now you are the prison warden and its fiercest guard. You're an icy man, a man who would grow up to dedicate his entire life to the same party that tortured him and his family as a boy. He was born to a leading party revolutionary and immortal. His family fell out of favour during the Cultural Revolution. Red Guard subjected his father to public humiliation, hauling him onto platforms, shining lights into his eyes, shouting in his ears until he fainted. Xi says he feared for his life in this period. Red Guards captured him when he was just 14 years old, told him he had just 5 minutes to live. They subjected him to struggle sessions, forced his own mother to participate, shouting slogans denouncing him as her son. They kidnapped and imprisoned him. He ran away one night from a detention centre. He showed up shivering at his own mother's door. "I'm hungry," he told her. And his own mother turned him away and reported him to the authorities. He says he cried and ran out into the night before being recaptured. The inhumanity and brutality of that is difficult to contemplate, even for hardened opponents like myself. They drove his half-sister to suicide. How can he serve this party that did this to his own family? These are the horrors that I would not wish on my worst enemy, but he grew up to inflict them on others. Power rotted away his soul, and he will fail. No matter how long it takes, he will fail. I'll leave you now with a simple cry of a fallen hero, a noble doctor. Xi's men tried to censor and silence Dr. Li Wenliang. A healthy society should not have just one voice. And I will echo the cry of the heroic Beijing bannerman Peng Lifa. Dignity, not lies. Reform, not cultural revolution. Votes, not leaders. Be citizens, not slaves. Students, workers, strike and depose the despotic traitor Xi Jinping. Arise, ye who refuse to be slaves against dictatorship, save China. I hope and pray that the Chinese people will soon rise up and take what is rightfully theirs: democracy, freedom, justice and dignity. Not the false pride and hollow dignity of empire and imperial rule, which we in the West once imposed on China and much of the world unfairly, unjustly, to our lasting shame and discredit. Nor the false pride promoted by the fascists and the reactionary scoundrels of our day who dream of a world reduced to a desert of hate, violence and lies, a world crushed beneath the jackboot and the tread of the tank, a world where one's dignity depends solely on the knowledge that there are those who subsist on lower strata, that their humanity is abused and denied. No, I hope that the Chinese people and the world at large will know the pride and dignity of democratic self-rule, the pride and dignity that comes with the establishment of a just society that cares for the weak and shelters the vulnerable, a good and just society that protects, promotes and values the dignity of each and every person. This is my hope for China and the world at large. This is the world we can create together. May I proclaim the establishment of the People's Republic with the words: the Chinese people have stood up. It was a lie. He knew it was a lie. He said this knowing he and his regime would simply be plunging the Chinese people into new forms of slavery. I look forward to a world in which the Chinese people throw off the shackles of tyranny and take back their freedom. Then, well, may we say, the Chinese people have stood up. May that day come soon. May it also come in Iran and Russia, Belarus and Myanmar. Everywhere humanity is crushed and denied. May that day come, even here in the West where our democracies are increasingly fraying under the groan of plutocratic rule and authoritarianism. Let the cry ring out everywhere. Here, the people have stood up. Humanity will be all the better for it. Thank you, everyone.
So the way you guys today will work, I'll questions to Drew for around 15 or so minutes, and I'm going to go to audience questions. So do start thinking about what you'd like to ask Drew, because I'm keen to hear from you as much as possible.
Yes, absolutely.
So the first question I wanted to ask you is that, at least in my inbox, I didn't actually receive a bomb threat for this event, which is a surprise. So are we not important enough?
Look, I actually was quite concerned that there'd be a bomb threat against this event, because since I returned to Australia after being stranded in London with that fake bomb threat, there have been multiple bomb threats still sent out in my name. They're still using Proton Mail. It's a farce. We've had to go to the Australian Federal Police. Proton Mail has now suspended new account creation in my name and the names of my brother, father, mother, family members. And so since then, there have been no longer any fake bomb threats. But you know, there were about 10 or so basically since I got back. And I mean, shockingly, it escalated to the point where they sent child pornography to the Australian E-Safety Commissioner using a fake Proton Mail in my name. So we've gone to Proton Mail, they've halted new account creation in my name, they've suspended all these accounts. We've gone to the Australian Federal Police. I hope there's an investigation ongoing. They're committing criminal offences here. And look, it's just a shocking example of the fact that they'll go after anyone at any time. It's pretty crazy that they'd go after me, because when I started, I tried to touch on it a little bit in my speech. I was not really a professional activist, did not think I'd be in this life at all. Just a 20-year-old random dude, dad runs a fruit shop, and then suddenly they were going after me. I was being denounced by the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I mean, they just cannot broach criticism anywhere. And so, yeah, what's happened to me, sadly, is an example of that. And honestly, I would just not wish that on my worst enemy, the fake bomb threats I did, going after my brother with bomb threats against airlines in America. We all know how serious America takes terrorism. I was worried that he was going to get the FBI knocking down his door. So I just wouldn't wish that on my worst enemy. It's a ridiculous thing, and I hope the police are investigating.
Well, thank you for sharing that, and also sorry to hear about your experience. I want to spend a little bit of time now thinking about sort of the Chinese political system.
Yeah, sure.
So of course, Xi Jinping has just been returned for basically unprecedented third term. So do you sort of think this is a significant moment in Chinese politics? Do you think sort of their foreign policy is going to change, or is this sort of a tipping point in any regard?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, Andreas Fulda, a German China expert, I think he's at the University of Nottingham, he described Xi's recent assumption as, you know, the new era of Führer rule in China. And I think he's absolutely right. This is an era of genocide, imperialism, foreign aggression. This is what we're going to be facing for the coming years ahead. I don't know whether anything other than simply decoupling, boycotting, divesting, sanctioning, extricating ourselves from supply chains in China. I don't know whether there's anything we can do really. It's a brutal system. He's now assumed basically the power of emperor for life. It does not seem like he will ever be toppled internally. I think the public humiliation of Hu Jintao, the paramount leader of China for 10 years prior to Xi, the public humiliation of him at the recent CCP summit in full view of the world, I think that was very indicative of the fact that Xi now has absolutely total power. For many years, people would talk about how the party elders would hopefully restrain Xi, and the party elders were grumbling about Xi's overturning of norms. Well, now you have Hu Jintao let out, publicly humiliated before the entire world. They're saying, oh, he was sick. Well, there was actually a Spanish newspaper that took photos just prior to the incident, and you can see Xi make the order to the porters to take Hu Jintao out, and he clearly didn't want to leave. He resisted. I think the scariest part, you can see these men on the Politburo, people who were promoted to positions of vast power and influence under Hu Jintao. He mentored them. These were his colleagues. And they all stare glassily ahead. They won't even dare meet his eyes as he's being led out. And something about that is very terrifying and menacing. Hu Jintao's no angel. I mean, he was referred to as the butcher of Lhasa by the Tibetans. But still, I mean, the fact that Hu Jintao, the former paramount leader of China, can be so publicly humiliated in front of the entire world. You cannot even search Xi Jintao's name now on Chinese social media. I think it's indicative of the fact that, you know, we've come to an era of vast power concentrated in one man, the Führer principle. He's ruling China as a Führer, and I truly believe this is a fascist government. You can only see it in the appeals to Han, racial nationalism. I mentioned the speech where he talks about implanting the Chinese national ideal directly into the hearts of the minority groups, and he once said recently, anyone who tries to split up China, he said this to a crowd of 70,000 people, and there was a vast roar of approval. He said, anyone who tries to split up China will have their heads bashed bloody against a great wall of steel. I mean, we're hearing fascist language out of the Chinese Communist Party, out of Xi Jinping. Anyone who thinks that, we're still in, ordinary times here, they're completely deluding themselves. I mean, Andrew Forrest, Twiggy Forrest, one of Australia's top billionaires, he gave an interview to the Australian Financial Review just a couple of months ago saying, oh, look, I still trust the competence of Chinese economic planners. And we've got a few who are in power now in China. I mean, how can you delude yourself to such an extent? I cannot understand it. I mean, he trusts the competence of Chinese economic planners. It's a society that's being driven into ruin by ruinous one-man rule, a reign of terror. Kevin Rudd, the former Prime Minister of Australia, he did a PhD on Xi Jinping here at Oxford, Jesus College, I believe. He describes Xi's current rule as a reign of terror. And Andrew Forrest, Twiggy Forrest, comes out and goes, I still trust the competence of economic planners in China. Good luck to you, Andrew Forrest. Good luck to you, mate. If you want to, tie your business and your future wealth to, the competence of economic planners in China, good luck to you. That's all I'd have to say. Yeah.
And just following up, because you mentioned about sort of what we should be doing against China, I sort of wanted to know, how do you think we should respond to this sort of consolidation of power? And I suppose one of the sort of key debates really is that should our activism actually be channeled at Western governments to try and pressure the Chinese government directly,
yes,
or should our activism actually be more directed at the Chinese government itself? So where would you sort of draw that line? Who do you think the pressure should be aimed at?
Look, I think you need to aim pressure at both. Clearly, the Chinese Communist Party does not like being publicly humiliated across the world. I mean, they tried to hide evidence of the Uyghur genocide. They don't want these crimes to be, brought to the forefront of world attention. They hate the fact that it's brought to the front of world attention. That's why they try and bribe developing countries at the United Nations. They try and twist their arms into voting with them to say, everything's fine in Xinjiang. China hates when its crimes are exposed. The Chinese Communist Party I'm referring to, because as I always try and make clear, I make a very clear distinction between the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese people themselves who have been brutalized by the Chinese Communist Party. We've always got to make that distinction because, ultimately they're suffering under this regime, and I just want the dignity of ordinary Chinese people to be recognised. I believe in human rights for all people everywhere, regardless of where the border stops. I'm not going to stop believing that, the value of a human life is precious just simply because a human person is overseas. And so I think we've got to put as much pressure as we can. I think boycott, divestment, sanctions, trying to put economic pressure on the Chinese government as much as we can, as much diplomatic pressure as possible. And I think the minimum is we've got to be protecting members of the diaspora communities here in Britain, Australia, the US. You heard in my speech, Tibetans, Uyghurs, Hong Kongers, ordinary Chinese citizens, when they're living in the West or living abroad, they continue to be targeted by the Chinese government. And so we've got to do everything possible to protect them. We've got to really protect academic freedom at our universities where, it's a great initiative that Oxford University has introduced where they're going to anonymise student essays because, as I mentioned in my speech, I know many, many Chinese students at Australian universities who have had family members visited by Chinese state security officials within 24 hours of them, just even making a comment critical of Xi Jinping in class. This is something that's happening ongoing in Australia. It's very bad in Australia. The Australian university system, the Group of 8, it is a horror. It is a horror. They've completely sold out. If you ever wanted a picture of just total subservience, weakness, spinelessness, moral spinelessness, you look at the Group of 8 in Australia. I remember at the University of Queensland, and this is something that actually prompted me to try and protest back in Australia. Remember the University of Queensland, they put out a statement condemning Trump's Muslim visa ban. Good on them. I support the university on that effort. It was a terrible thing that Trump did. I support the human rights effort. Why do they say absolutely nothing about the fact that this government has rounded up 1 million Muslims in concentration camps? Why the hypocrisy? What is the different standard here? And I think the different standard is just simply the money involved. And I mentioned in my speech, they spent $500,000 trying to expel me from campus at the University of Queensland because the Chinese government put out state media articles calling for my expulsion. And then the University of Queensland, which has, $200 million a year, their budget coming from China, 20% of the budget,
when the Chinese consulate says jump, they say how high. Peter Hui, the vice chancellor of the university, he was getting a $200,000 bonus every single year for meeting KPIs related to increasing engagement with China. And he was on the board of Hanban, a Chinese government operation that runs Confucius Institutes worldwide. He was on the board of Hanban. He received a medallion from China's Vice Premier 2015, the most outstanding individual of the year award for promoting Confucius Institutes worldwide. I didn't mention this in my speech, but the Confucius Institute at the University of Queensland was directly involved in funding 4 courses. One of these courses was asking students to consider the fact that Uyghurs were overrepresented in terror statistics in China, and they were asking students to consider whether Hong Kongers were terrorists. So these courses funded by the Confucius Institute, which is an arm of the Chinese state, are pushing the Chinese government propaganda line on ongoing atrocities. I already mentioned in my speech, the University of Queensland had a professor, the youngest guy to ever be made a professor at UQ, Hung Ta-Shen. He used Australian Research Council grants and the University of Queensland resources to develop AI surveillance technology that he then took to China, created a business called Koala AI, which was then used against Uyghurs in the ongoing genocide. Australian university resources were used here. And so the universities are just absolutely cowardly. They have been absolutely silent on this stuff. Peter Hui, he was most outstanding individual of the year award for promoting Confucius Institutes, while the Confucius Institutes basically taught that there was no such thing as Uyghur genocide. And he was getting $200,000 a year bonus for deepening ties with China. And then he directs the university to go after me, expel me. They ended up compiling tens of thousands of pages of surveillance on me. Their public justification was, we're expelling Drew Pavlou for using a pen in a campus art shop and not paying for the pen. He put it back on the shelf after taking a note. They're telling the Australian public they spent $500,000 going after me for stealing a $2 pen. No one can believe that. It's nuts. It's absolutely insanity. How did they even know that I used the pen? I mean, the surveillance, you know. This is what happened at the University of Queensland. Absolute cowardice. And if we're asking what can we do? I mean, the very least is we're not complicit in these atrocities. And we were complicit at the University of Queensland in the atrocities. I was a student there, and I was just sickened that my university that I loved was complicit in atrocities, in a genocide. I remember reading about the Rwandan genocide when I was a kid, reading about the Holocaust. I told myself when something like this happens again in history, as it inevitably does, you know, when genocide rears its ugly head again in history, I wanted to be one of the people that spoke out. And I saw my university developing really close economic ties with the Chinese government, being completely silent on atrocities. The Vice Chancellor, Peter Hui, was actually getting medallions from the Chinese government, promoting him, you know, for his efforts promoting Confucius Institute, Chinese government propaganda. This was happening at my university. When I tried to protest against it, they tried to expel me. Very least, we're not complicit in this. We have to protect the diaspora, we've got to protect academic freedom, stop the violence on our streets. I mean, the Chinese consulate, when they drag protesters onto the grounds of the consulate in Bashton, expel the ambassador. I didn't mention this in my speech. Another one, Zhu Zhe, the Chinese consul general in Brisbane, when I was a student there, he put out a statement endorsing the violence of the people who attacked me on campus as patriotic. He called me a separatist. Zhu Zhe, he was actually made an honorary professor by the University of Queensland a couple of weeks before he made that statement, endorsing violence against me and other students. And what did the university do? They went after me, not Zhu Zhe. And Zhu Zhe, in the end, no consequences for him. He should have been expelled from the country, declared persona non grata. You can't endorse violence against Australian citizens. That's not a consular function. You know, diplomatic immunity, yes, but it's not a consular function to endorse violence against Australian citizens. It should have been declared persona non grata. But unfortunately, no one wants to rock the boat. The Confucius Institute at UQ was not closed when, you know, they've actually been proven to be funding Chinese government propaganda on campus. This is the very least. Don't be complicit in these crimes. Yes.
Great. Well, I'm going to ask one more question because I do want to go to the audience because we've still got about 15, 20 minutes left. So the final question I wanted to ask is about the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative.
Yeah.
So do you think this is one of the main reasons they've been able to continue to gain more international influence and they've been able to remain generally unchallenged on the human rights abuses which are now generally quite public, at least in my opinion?
Yeah, look, it's a very interesting thing, the Belt and Road project. It is clearly a political project. I mean, it's political at its very core. The whole idea is to try and reorient trade across Eurasia, make China basically the centre of a vast trade tributary system. That way it can avoid being blockaded at sea if it ever tries to invade Taiwan. Completely political project, and we've seen, you know, the massive investment flows that go into these countries. It is used as basically a way to twist arms at the UN and twist arms when it comes to the diplomatic status of developing countries. We saw the Solomon Islands, for example. They switched recognition from Taiwan to the People's Republic of China after massive injection of Chinese funds, and now they're delaying elections, and they've tried to sign deals with the Chinese government that would bring Chinese military police onto the islands. We're seeing how trade is weaponized by the Chinese Communist Party. It's very clear that they weaponize trade against countries. I mean, they weaponize trade against Australia. When Australia, displeased the Chinese government, they levied trade sanctions on Australia, wiped out many businesses across Australia, and then they issued a list of demands, and they said, if you want these trade sanctions to be lifted, you've got to